IVM.
Hi, everybody. On behalf of the team at IVM Podcast, I have a request for you. We'd really appreciate it if you could go to ivmpodcast.com/survey and fill out our survey over there. It's going to take a few minutes to do, but it gives us some really interesting information that we can take to advertisers and brands about who's listening to the network. If you're comfortable giving us your email address, while you're filling out the survey, we'll enter you into a random drawing where we'll be sending out a bunch of IVM swag to some of our listeners. Last year we sent out coffee mugs, and this year we're hoping to send out much cooler stuff. That's ivmpodcast.com/survey. We really appreciate your help.
If you see from the beverage point of view, coffee was in the initial stages costly because it was a rarity to so many people. It was not something that we made in our houses, if you see. So it started from the India coffee houses. I see it as two ways. People who visited India coffee houses who understood what a great beverage this is. And two, travelers back to the country who served in the war, who were military men. For them, caffeine boosting kick of camp coffee was provided to them. Camp coffee was a relational term that you can find both in the French wars and the World War references and people who served in the wars.
Hello and welcome to the Filter Coffee Podcast. I can introduce my guest for today in multiple ways. He's a coffee connoisseur, a fair trade evangelist, a cafe consultant, and many, many more. I personally would like to call him a coffee activist. Vignesh is a software engineer by the day, but his initiative, which he calls the Madras coffee movement, is likely to impact, and in a good way, a cup of coffee you or me will order in a cafe very, very soon. He consults with cafes across the country to up their coffee game. He's a roasting consultant for brands that want to have their own blends. And he also helps coffee farmers, especially the smaller ones, bring out a better crop every year and also get a better price for them. His goal is to make good coffee more accessible. Bring out an Indian coffee that makes it to the worldwide cup of excellence, and also make filter coffee a global phenomenon. In all likelihood, this is going to be the nerdiest episode on the show ever, and we are likely to get pretty technical about coffee. We're also likely to bust a lot of myths, but mostly we are likely to celebrate the story of coffee in India. Welcome to the Filter Coffee Podcast, Vignesh.
Thank you. It was a pleasure of mine.
It's ironic that it took me it has taken me 77 episodes to actually do an episode on coffee, which is, also the title of the show.
Yes.
So, we've connected a few times before this recording, and absolutely fascinated by what you do as the Madras coffee movement, and the way you call it. Why don't we start by you telling us why you do what you do and what do you do?
Sure. So the professional part of it, I'm a software engineer, but I think that's where all startups turn out into. Why doing software engineering and what do we want to do? Mine started with my grandfather actually. So he was a particular filter coffee person. Particular in filter coffee, I meant he couldn't take chicory. He couldn't just go to a place and buy their own blends or packets. During the late stage of his life, he was I had never had coffee. I was just an Ovaltine Boost type of a person. 6 years before. He was in his last stages, but he was always fascinated by good coffees. So probably we were all situated down south. We visited places like this Kumbakonam, Tanjavur, where it is not a filter coffee scene, but the coffee scene in small places have a significant history, like where they buy from, how they do, who opens up at 5 a.m., or who gets the freshest milk and all of that. And him growing around that region knew a lot about it.
This is a local legend of which tea shop has the best brew.
Has the best brew and all of that. Right. Which specific shop doesn't use instant was a specific thing. Even though they open at
Got
5, how fresh is their decoction and all of that? Do they do second decoctions? Do they add a lot of water? And it's a small thing, what people drink in those places.
And you also mentioned chicory. So for the benefit of the uninitiated, chicory is something that people add, especially in South India, to improve the texture of the coffee and not necessarily its taste. Is that correct?
Yes. It's more of the viscosity of the extract.
Right.
If you're doing it at a larger scale and you don't have a control, but if you see, sorry to go a bit away, but if you see theoretically, it is used across to have a standardized ratio, extract and viscosity for the decoction. Which is
we'll come to the technicalities of coffee in a bit, but you were talking about your story. Yeah.
Yes. So when he was so specific, when he started drinking coffee, during his later years, he was mentioning specifically about saying that, there's so many things that you can do at home, but there's only one thing that I'm always missing for a while, which is a good fresh cup of coffee. For me, it was like, you take me to every store. We used to walk down the street. All the colors is the same. So this powder is also brown. That powder is also brown. I don't know what do you mean by fresh. Then he said, this is not how I used to have coffee. He said he used to go to the India coffee house stores. He used to pick the green beans that he needs. He was telling me the difference between a plantation peaberry, a cherry arabica. So those are terms, cherry arabica and plantation arabica. And he used to blend them in the proportions that he need. Let's say 30, 40, 40 or 40, 30, 30, 80, 20 and stuff like that. He used to bring them, roast it and grind it and have a fresh cup of coffee. And he always used to say, when you roast it, you should not use it the same day. It should take a day before you grind it. He was a bit specific. And he said, post the advent of these small stores, I couldn't have access to all the methods that I used to do before. And I am now forced to get it from these places. I am not sure when they roast, how they roast, or why is the coffee tasting stale. For a person who's not had coffee at all 6 years ago, I had no clue what to do. But I was brought up by them. So it was always a thing for me to get them a good cup of coffee. At least get him to tell, what, this is good. This is at least close to what I was having. It was just a personal thing back then.
So that is what set you on this, or rather inspired you on this journey of coffee. I didn't know you started drinking coffee only 6 years back.
6 years ago, yes.
Wow. Oh, extraordinary. What the story tells me is that there's been a great culture of coffee appreciation in this country many, many centuries before it became cool to talk about it, right? And if you look at the global history of coffee, I think the most accepted legend is about this herder in Ethiopia, probably in the early 1600s, who notices that his goats become suddenly energetic when they eat from the coffee shrubs. And then he goes on to experiment with the beans, and then coffee as we know today is born. Then it travels around Arabia, enters Turkey. The first cafes of the world are sort of created. And then finally, it makes its way to present-day Europe, where I think, among many other things, it also has a bit of a tiff with the church, which takes its own time before it sort of accepts coffee as a beverage. So all of this is happening between the early and the late 1600s. When it comes to India, when does the story begin and where does it begin?
So I'll start the history in two parallel lines. The first parallel line is being the Arab traders who've influenced a lot of trade around the world, bringing in the beans to the country and planting it in the mountainous ranges of the Chikmagalur and Coorg, to a point that can be factually and also technically correct, because trade was the only way people got so many commodities in those days. And if you see, instead of Ethiopia, Yemen or the places around Yemen, till date, grow one of the best coffees in the world. I mean, for some of the growers, it's a long lost tradition. But if you see, initially going through to multiple places, that's how the trade started. So let us consider that part of the fact to be the traders bringing in, or the great saint Baba Bodhan, who's bringing in and growing the coffees here. But popularizing what was being grown was done only in the British colonial era, where they set up estates and they had people growing it, exporting it majorly to Britain. Then let's have that as one part of it. Part two is there are some records of court person in Jahangir reign who used to say that people drink, this is also available on Wikipedia, but if you can go deeper at some point, you can research more. But people say that people don't drink a lot of alcohol or wine here. What they get intoxicated by is a fresh beverage made out of beans called coffee that are roasted and brewed in water, just hot water. And that drink gives them happiness, it takes them on a high, and they find it so pleasant. This is with the Jahangir era.
Right.
Coming back, 1700s is our actually first recorded version of the India coffee house, or the Madras coffee houses, or coffee houses for that matter.
And that is more of a cafe back then, or was it more of a commodity trading sort of a piece?
So they wanted to recreate a typical sort of, it was not a cafe, it was not a commodity, but where they had these trade ports, where they had people coming in from the country. I think it was also due to because they didn't have a lot of air travel back then. It was by ships. And when you welcome such people, you had to have a common place where they could come, refresh, meet the great leaders here, and then take it from there. So these cafes had, the English and European newspapers. They had some local snacks. And particularly, there was one specific text that said coffee in those cafes was the costliest commodity at 1 rupee.
Oh, wow. It's fascinating, right? I think Baba Bodhan is a Sufi saint, and he comes in somewhere around 1670s. Is that
1670s, yes. Yeah.
Around that time.
Yeah.
And definitely he comes from Yemen. He must have probably come through one of the port towns.
Yeah.
But he seems to very quickly settle down in Chikmagalur.
Yeah.
And then that's how the Chikmagalur story begins in the Indian history, isn't it?
Right.
Why is Chikmagalur a great place for coffee to grow? And any recorded history on how he ended up discovering the place?
I'm not able to find out, nor have I got an actual factual version that says, this is how he came and all of that.
Right.
But through one of the trading ports, if you see, why Chikmagalur or why Coorg, that whole belt means that. So just to go a little bit technical, the coffee actually originated from a type of there are different varietals to it, but it is from a plant, the seed or whatever is from a plant.
Right.
Let us call the most original plant as plant A, for example, going into technique. So it went into different countries and it took out different names based on its natural hybrid varietals or the hybrid varietals crafted there and all of that. The original varietal that had come to our country was called Kent's. Kent was name of an English person who had his own place there, as he helped in the lot of cultivation and promoting the growing of coffee and the people employed for it and the export. It was named after his varietal called the Kent's. That was the most popular varietal, which can date back or which can trace back to the original one.
Okay.
If you see the factually, they are connecting both because a lot of Kent's was grown on the Chikmagalur Coorg belt. If you see, it's on the highest elevation of Chikmagalur. And also, for a good coffee to grow, it has to be at least 1800 meters above sea level. Very good coffee to grow. I mean, the world's best coffees, if you see, there are at least 1,600 meters or more above sea level. The other places doesn't mean they grow good coffee. But back in those days, before the advent of all this technology with processing, farming and all of that, high-grown coffees were a rarity, were a gem, rather than the low-elevation grown coffees.
Okay. And generally, the place between the Tropic of Cancer and Tropic of Capricorn, the equatorial region, is what we refer to as the coffee belt or the bean belt, right?
Yeah.
And since you mentioned what is an ideal place to grow, I'm assuming largely there are 3 areas in the world where beans are from. One is the Latin American part of it, and then the kind of coffee which is probably closer to the origin, which is the Arabian and African belt. and then the Asia Pacific sort of a belt, right?
Right.
And
two new belts that people are growing. One is in Australia, and one is in the last state in the United States.
Oh wow, wonderful!
So
very different climatic environments
yes,
there, isn't it?
Yes, but I think for Australia it would make sense because another part of Australia can be humid. You would just need a little bit of elevation to start growing in, and with the advance that we have, you can bring in that humidity and the soil pH and all of that to grow coffees. And I've seen specialty coffees exported from Australia that have reached the United States.
Oh wow, wonderful! You mentioned about the India Coffee House, right? Is that what it was called?
Yeah.
Right. And
there were notations about calling it as coffee houses, Madras Coffee House,
right.
Coffee Syndicate of Madras, India Coffee Houses. There are so many long last names and these small coffee cafes that we can.
And that seems to have had a very big impact in the culture of coffee itself, right? Like the cafe. I was just reading recently that, even in the 1600s in Constantinople, which is erstwhile, which is present day Turkey, I think coffee was usually served in a very culturally rich environment where there was a lot of song and music and travelers used to congregate and all of that, right? So in India was the beginning of that. Well, of course, we must have had smaller shops, etc. before. Was the beginning of that sort of a culture in our own unique way, these India coffee houses and Madras coffee houses. Is that how it began for us?
If you see from the beverage point of view, coffee was in the initial stages costly because it was a rarity to so many people. It was not something that we made in our houses, if you see. So it started from the India coffee houses. I see it as two ways. People who visited India coffee houses who understood what a great beverage this is, and two, travelers back to the country who served in the war, who were military men and all of that. Because for them, for this caffeine boosting kick of camp coffee was provided to them. Camp coffee was a relational term that you can find both in the French wars and the World War references and people who served in the wars.
It sounds like black coffee. Is it?
Yes.
Is it black in nature? Okay.
It is black, but there were no particular references to it having a percentage of coffee, but it had a lot of chicory back then.
Okay. So chicory it's not just an Indian phenomenon, is it? It's somewhat of a global phenomenon.
Yeah, it is global. Taking a line tangentially, if you see the current version of a Greek coffee called the frappe, we've used to having a lot of frappe in multiple places. It originated in Greece, and the original part of the frappe was made out of instant coffee, which had chicory in it.
Wonderful. So coming back to the India story, I think we spoke about Baba Bodhan and the India Coffee House, etc. How did it sort of travel from there?
I'll take this in parallel to what was happening globally. So we've had the India coffee houses. We have records of Britishers congregating in these places and basically through the ports. And that's why Madras, the currently version of Chennai, has a great connection to coffee. So we've had records that says, there are coffee houses that are being established. People were served good coffee. Coffee was a thing here. And we started also growing coffee. If you see till the 1800s, we don't have any record. I mean, I have not seen any record of coffee being exported. But post 1800s, you have records. You have records in multiple estates as well. So there are estates that are, fifth generation, sixth generation, which date back to 160, 200 years, where they have a record book or log book of says, this year to this person we've exported.
Okay.
So early 1800s. Early 1800s are also references where nowadays estate owners, but people who used to work in the estates, were traveling to Latin America, Africa to get coffee seeds. The higher varietal or the higher cultivars of coffee seeds, a different version of the same plant to make it grow over here. So we've had that records. If you see in parallel, this is where the wave of coffee was happening globally. Like people term it as the three waves of coffee so far. The first wave being coffee being available as a cheap commodity for everyone. For example, you have the brands such as Folgers and all of that. If you see in reference to the United States, like instant coffees were popular. Coffee was just something that you could take out of a supermarket, make it easily at home. It wasn't so complicated. But on a same note, in the 1800s to 1900s is when you see, like the early part of 1900s, you have the mocha pots. On the Austrian version, there is a chemist-made lab equipment kind of a brewing equipment called the coffee siphon, where water heats up through pressure, it goes to another chamber and weight transfers over there, it brews back in. It's more like a lab equipment that you see. You have the Turkish pots being popular. So there were records of brewing equipments used extensively and people wanting to brew coffee in different ways. There was a filter called the Napolitana, from Napolitana. It had two chambers, top to bottom, and they had a small metallic filter mesh kind of a structure between them. If you see it, it will resemble typically to the South Indian filter without its handle. But it was done on a stove. So they'll put coffees, they'll heat water on a stove, they'll flip it, and it will start brewing. Mocha pot was generally made on gas. The siphon coffee was made with flame. So people initially were trying to devise different methods to brew coffee. In those same timeline, 1800s to 1900s. 1900s, early part of 1900s, we know the coffee board was established to control the coffee production, export coffees all over the world. So that is when, which was similar to the second wave of coffee, which was the advent of Starbucks, which was the advent of a place where you could go get a good cup of coffee and you knew where it came from. Like this came from Ethiopia, this came from Colombia, this is an Indian version and all of that. Oh, you knew that people had coffee, but they didn't know where it came from. Now you have a relation to what coffee is with you. If you see, though there is a second wave happening globally, those times the filter coffee, if you see down south, was too popular. It had different names called degree coffee, meter coffee, and all of that. Degree was also a thing down south in a small town called Kumbakonam, where people were we had a lot of milk vendors back then. And the smaller parts or the smaller milk houses in Kumbakonam, if you see, they had milk stored in those giant vessels, which came from their specific cow or buffalo or whatever. And they had a lactometer to it, which which was specifically used for milk. And people not knowing what a lactometer was, referenced it to a thermometer, considering how hot the milk should be when they brew coffee. So it was called a degree. It's a certain degree. And people said chicory was misinterpreted as degree. There was one other version around it. Right. And if you see the 1900s where second wave of coffee was happening, here filter coffee was popular to common households. A similar example to my household where during my grandmother era, it was in the 1940s, they said we had access to only limited quantities of coffee. Like we used to brew that again in case if we want to have it the second time. So it was like they used to call it ration. We were allowed a certain amount of powder in a day. So which would always be the first decoction. Then came the second. And everyone had a connection with a local roaster. Where you see the term roasters happening globally, you have coffee works happening here. Okay. You could still find a lot of coffee works in the country, like traditional coffee works, who've been roasting on a kind of a mission for the past, now if you see, they'll be roasting for about 70, 80 years. This is in parallel to the second wave. Coming to the third wave, now you have specialty coffees all around the world. You have the advent of great cafes, better brewing equipments, standardization of procedures. You are able to trace to which exact farm your coffee came from, what was its score at a standardized scale, which is established by the Specialty Coffee Association of America. You have particular ratios of water to coffee, you have water temperatures and all of that. And if you go into detail, you have a specific water that you have to use for coffee called the third wave water. You can't just use any other water. So now coffee has become a beverage that is so special, so exact and so complicated.
I think there are a lot of parallels to what is happening to coffee now, which is what happened to probably wine about 20, 30 years back. where it's becoming a much more specialized area of study. There's a lot of techniques involved, both in making as well as in tasting coffee, etc. Right? Just going back to the story briefly, Vignesh, we spoke about the cafes which are, right now sprouting in India, probably in the 1800s at some point, etc. And you spoke about how Madras back then was really the hub of coffee, mostly because it is a port town. Right? What kind of coffee was India making? Was it always the filter kind, or some of the other things that you spoke about, right, which is the siphon? And we'll come to brewing methods in a bit elaborately.
Yeah.
Were there other kinds of coffee that we were making in India?
Yeah. So, few people that I've met, old people who've been having coffees for the close to 60, 70 years, they mentioned two types of brewing apparatus. It seems the filter came in late or was available late at a larger scale. They had a percolatory method. Like there used to be a big jar where, it was similar to the Napolitana, the other filters where water was boiling and you had coffees. And coffee with milk was only effective so popular in areas where there were a lot of milk also being produced.
Oh, okay.
And people who had black coffee was a very specific thing in most of the households there. Households that were related to coffee. Maybe it was not brewed to the same exact measure that it is being done now, but people were used to black coffee back then as well.
Especially in rural India, I've seen a lot of people even today, preferring black coffee. So the black coffee culture seems to be fairly old in India, right?
Yes.
And at this point, this is still a South Indian phenomenon, geographically speaking. Is that correct? Okay. So we spoke about the early history of coffee in the 1600s globally. I think later on, there are many events that shape both the consumption as well as the market for coffee globally, right? Like, for example, in the 1860s, there is this one shop in Pittsburgh which sort of packages pre-roasted coffee in paper bags and sells it by the pound, which to me begins the B2C part of coffee, right? Where it becomes less of a commodity and more of a consumer product. And later on in 1901, Luigi Becerra invents the espresso machine, and that captures the imagination of coffee lovers globally, right? And then much later in 1938, Max sort of discovers instant coffee, which he brands as Nescafe. It's a bit of an unfortunate incident, but that then creates its own history, and it creates new dimensions to the whole market itself. What are the events that shaped the story of coffee in India?
Consumption of coffee, if you ask me, was more specialized back then. Might not be in terms of brewing, but in the way coffee as a culture was that was perceived. For example, the India coffee houses, if you see, there were some records of it having billiards tables, having some of great magazines where, writers, philanthropists come to meet, talk over a cup of coffee. And it was a very special place back then.
Right.
Brewing might not have been as advanced as it is now, like in terms of even espresso machines. There were different ways where we could brew coffee even now in other places. But the way coffee was perceived was more of a luxurious event back then, which slowly reached a common person as to how you can brew and have a cup of coffee. That was also the incidental advent of the coffee board in the 1900s, where they standardized the way coffee was being exported. Like there was a grading system. You could not just export anything back then. There is a common practice as to say, your grade has to be this, then you will be paid this. These many lots of this. This is the difference in terms of Arabica. You should have a process, which is a wet or a natural process. That is how you process coffees. And what do you get from it? What do you do for Robusta? And all of that. And with this India Coffee Board, we also had access. I think most of the households now got access to coffees. Because now that they've standardized, you also get, like how we get with first flush, second flush teas. People started getting access to good coffees. And through India coffee houses, if I remember correctly, through my grandfather's and his relative stories, there were green coffees, like you said, coffees pre-roasted, available in packets.
Right.
That 1900s was when they established and was the time where we were able to get those packets. There were many friends whom, in relation, when we talk about coffee, are able to relate to the story of their grandparents, their great-grandparents, getting the green beans, having them roasted over here. So it's in a skillet with a moving handle, or it's just on a skillet where people move it, and having a grinder attached to the kitchen countertop where they grind with this motion.
Got it. To me, the more we speak, it's clear that there are two threads to this history, right? One is the history of home brewing, which seems to be very, very rooted and dated in India. Even though it seems like a cool thing to do today, I think we've been doing this for centuries. And then there is, of course, what is happening in the supply side of it, right? In terms of retail, in terms of cafes, etc. When it comes to the home brewing part of it, was it largely an Indian phenomenon, or globally also is home brewing a culture? Because globally, it seems to be people had more access to cafes, etc. That seems to be the way coffee history went there.
Yes. So if you see globally, the exact brewing recipes or exact brewing taste or the perfect consistency that you get out of an espresso machine versus what you do at home through a mocha pot or any other brewing device for that matter would be largely different. Right. People can see a vast difference and access to good coffees. Here, if you see now that we are, so one thing that was always understated, we are a coffee growing country, and coffee was made accessible to most people in multiple forms over the years. You can have records of it from 1900s till today. Like you could still get coffees for as low as $300, but you could get coffees that are worth more than 2,000 rupees. We still have access to that. But in most of the countries that you see, there has been a vast difference in terms of the access of coffees per se, and also the access to simplistic home brewing methods. Like mocha pot looks a simple equipment, but when you compare it to the filter type of an equipment that we have here, it is not as simple. Here, it's just coffee, water, it's done. There, if it's fine, the mocha pot might get choked. If it's too coarse, it will become watery. There is similarities over here. But I also feel that was standardized by the coffee works here. They always gave us a consistent grind size. They couldn't differ. You couldn't go ask, can you give me a coarser grind size for this filter coffee? No, that was impossible. I mean, there was a standardization put in that place. Right or wrong is a different story, but we had a standardization there. In the cafes that you see, because of this not, at least to my knowledge, not being so easily available. Like you have a coffee work, I have a coffee works down the road, like just a street down the road. Any other South Indian city that I've been to, there is a coffee works. There is something down the road. It's like just walkable.
Correct.
The same contrast, a remote area in Europe or let's say in the United States, for them to have access to a roaster who could supply them fresh coffees is not so easy. So even now, if you see, the roasters are more popular in the cities,
right? Like
the metropolitan cities and all of that. But here you have access to them even to any other city that you go to. So I think for us, home brewing was always a thing. There were certain homes who perfected the art of home brewing more than what an expert can tell. But I think we had an advantage over that.
Great. That's a fantastic place for us to take a very quick break. When we come back, I want to go deeper into the techniques of coffee, which we seem to have perfected in this country a long, long time back. Stay with us. We'll be right back on the Filter Coffee Podcast.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. If you're not following us on social media, don't you think it's about time you started? We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. I wanted to kind of just give a quick reminder to everybody. As I mentioned up top, we are doing our annual listener survey right now. If you could please go and take a couple of minutes out of your day and fill it out, we would really, really appreciate it. It's ivmpodcast.com/survey. If you're comfortable giving us your email address, we'll enter you into a random drawing, and we're going to be sending out swag to a bunch of randomly selected listeners. So do definitely get on board that train. let me tell you a little bit about what we did on the network this week. We launched a new show called Zindagi Diaries with Ragini Kumar. Many of you might have seen Ragini on television during the IPL. She's a presenter, but she's showing a different side of herself over here with a poetry podcast. Give it a shot, give it a listen. Let me know what you all think. Vishal Gondal is back this week after a while. He's been on an extended break, but he has Rahul Narvekar for the first episode. Really interesting conversation. Do check it out. Raji Samant joins Gauri Devidayal on This Round Is On Me, the two talk about the wine business and what's going on there. We had a number of conversations about the Farmers' Bill and the surrounding agitation this week on the network as well. Maruk Inayat had a great episode on the note. Pulyabazi did a deep dive into the issues around this. And on Siders, we have our typical, fun conversation about this stuff with a little bit of a seriousness, a little bit of fun. Do check that out on Cock and Bull on Thursday last week. Akash Mehta joined us for that episode. And with that, let me get you back to your show.
Welcome back to the Filter Coffee Podcast. We're speaking to Vignesh about the history of coffee. And I just wanted to quickly pivot into what is today an extraordinarily fashionable, cool thing to talk about, but something that also has a lot of history and science behind it, which is the brewing techniques, right? I think before we go into that, Vignesh, just to set the context for the uninitiated, in the audience. So there are only two types of coffee beans, right? The Arabica and the Robusta. Is that correct?
Yeah, no, there are more. There were more. But if you see now, more commonly, three types are popular. One is called the Liberica. If you see in Chikmagalur also, it is called Marakapi. That grows on higher trees. The tree itself is different. But the most common things were Arabica and Robusta. I also feel it is because that was the most common thing sought out in exports and that was easy to maintain.
Okay, so there are actually many, but these seem to be dominating the trade more than anybody else, right? Okay, cool. And they seem to have a very different flavor, at least these two. One is a very pale green, one is a very dark green. And they also seem to taste differently depending on the place they are grown, right? What I understand is the coffee grown in Central America, which is more Arabica, is more acidic than, for example, what is grown in Southern America, right? And Robusta seems to be more of a Arabian, Asian sort of a thing, rather than a South American thing. And that coffee seems to be more, when you grow it in Africa and Arabia, more about the floral sort of a smell. And in India or Asia Pacific, it's more herbal and spice related as a palate, right? Are these all correct myths, more or less?
With the notes, it can always be subjective, but to a standardized version, it is correct. So if you look at it the standardized way, you have a coffee tasting wheel where they relate it to aroma, flavor tones, bitterness, astringent. It's all correct. But at a perceivable nature, the simplistic version is Arabica, let's say it's more smoother on your palate. Like the Robusta is more sharper. And in the Asia region, if you see, the Robusta is more popular and it's exported a lot because if you have an espresso machine and you run a small cafe, blending an Arabica and Robusta would, and also having a bit of Robusta in it. If you see when you do the espresso shots, right, there's a crema, there's a layer of nice foam on top of it. So visually looking at it, the crema would sound or look a more full-bodied, or it will have a higher crema content if you have a little bit of Robusta on it. And naturally, Robusta growing at a lower altitude will reduce your prices as an espresso blend. That will help you at a cost level as well.
Okay. And do these two beans also, do they differ in terms of the strength of the coffee? I don't even know if that's the right way of describing coffee. Yeah.
But the most relatable version, like if we talk about caffeine, the Robusta would have more caffeine than the Arabica. But if you see just the caffeine content. But caffeine is also misunderstood in coffee, if I must say. Because
why do you say that?
The darker you roast, more amount of caffeine is actually lost. Most of the coffees that a common person drinks is dark roast coffees. And the caffeine content is actually low. So this caffeine and this coffee related issues, health issues that have also been prevalent was also because of the large amount of chicory present in the coffee. Like a common supermarket blend would at least have a minimum of 40% chicory and 60% of coffee. And that 60% of coffee was not in was not in a typical Arabica fashion. That 60% can have more of Robusta and more of Arabica as well. That blend had a higher caffeine content than coffee itself. So it is another whole way of how coffee and caffeine and all that came into place.
Wonderful. So this myth that a darker roast is actually a more stronger coffee, and if you were to define strength by caffeine, is actually what it is. It's a myth. It's not correct.
Lighter roasts have a larger amount of caffeine, and it is a lot more caffeine milligrams in your cup that you drink.
Wow, I did not know that. Okay, so moving on to the brewing method itself, right? I think it seems to me that in India there were at least 2 or 3 very prevalent methods. One is the drip coffee. Would you say that the South Indian filter is in a way sort of a drip sort of a method?
South Indian filter, I was struggling a lot to get to the exact history of it, but it is common to, in my opinion, 3 other brewing methods. One is that Napolitana that I spoke about. If you can Google the Napolitana filter at some point, you could see the apparatus to be very similar to a South Indian filter. But was Napolitana inspired by the South Indian filter, or this the other way around? We don't have factual evidence, because the older evidences suggest that we brew the coffee beans in water, which is not what you do with the South Indian filter. And the other similar version is you have a Vietnamese filter called the fin filter. So that will have a top, it will have a filtered sieve, but it is used on a per cup basis. Like you put it on your cup, you brew and you leave it. It cannot be done at a larger scale of 10, 20 cups. You have to have 10 filters for that matter, which you keep on every single cup. But that has this umbrella type thing that you put over a filter. It has the same amount of covering on top. You could have coffees dripping at the same rate from that filter when you compare it with a South Indian filter. The most common was this filter, and it was South Indian. It was this Madras filter coffee. It was associated to a lot of Brahminical households as to how it is a thing when they come in, and that, I think, popularized it.
Right. In a previous episode we did on caste, there was actually this discussion that we did, which is on is the filter coffee actually a symbol of caste? Because there seems to be in the courts of Madras at least a lot of evidences of how people from other castes were not allowed to order coffee in a cafe. Their entry was not bad. They could come in, they could order food, for example, but they can't order coffee because there was supposed to be an elite drink. I don't know how much truth there is to it, but this came up in the discussion. You said something about you researching the history of the South Indian filter itself, because that seems to be, while it might be similar to the Napolitana, it seems to be very unique, at least the form factor of it, right? How did we come about? What is the history of filter coffee?
I was not able to get to the exact point of how it was made, but it was similar to the basic principles of how you can brew coffee. Like you had to have an apparatus that could hold temperature. Incidentally, if you see, we used brass or bronze filters, metal filters. Yes. Stainless steel was the later point. If you see the thermal conductivity of that, it could hold in heat more. And what was made through the South Indian filter was there was no pressure involved, but the pressure was made in a completely different way. Like you had a small bed of coffee that was in the top portion. You had a bottom portion to it, and you used to pour hot water over the top portion. But what happened was when you closed it, there is a sense of not 100%, but there's a sense of vacuum in the top chamber. Like the only way, and the grounds were fine, the only way water could reach through due to the basics of gravity was to go through the grains. So we relied only on that to make the drip. And water, in all scientific terms, if you see, when water and coffee interact for a longer period in time, like a graph, if you draw time versus water and coffee sitting together, the more the amount of time water and coffee sit together, it extracts more, like it over extracts.
Okay.
So if you see in common households, the South Indian filter is kept overnight. If you see the morning, the brew is still thick and it is over extracted, and people cannot have it black. It is not acidic, it is astringent. It is astringency that you feel in your mouth. It will be very sharp. It is not a pleasant astringent feeling. In coffee, there is a pleasant astringent feeling. There is an unpleasant astringent feeling, like how you score coffees. So in a way, if you see the filter in itself, the apparatus is a brilliantly designed apparatus, but because of not standardizing your brew method, like not having a common brew method, like espresso, it's called a portafilter. What the baristas take out of the machine. It has standardization in terms of a single shot, double shot, etc. Like a double shot has a better gasket, you know where to level it, and some way or the other you'll be within the espresso standards. Like it will be either 14 grams of coffee or 18 grams of coffee, because the espresso puck can hold only that much. There was a standardization put in place there. Like the Chemex, the pour over drip that you see.
Right.
There's an European version called the Chemex, which is like a glass, the R
it's
glass.
It's a version
thing.
Of the drip.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. If you see, you have a paper, which is the most common filtering equipment used, and there is only so much coffee that you could put up. But for that so much of coffee, you know how much water you wanted below, because there is a 1 cup Chemex, 2 cup Chemex, 3 cup, 4 cup to 6 cup Chemex. Mocha pot, there's 1 cup, 2 cup till 10 cup. Right. So there was a way where coffee and water was ratio, proportioned in different. In South Indian filter as well, you have a 2 cup, 3 cup to 10 cup. But that 2 cup to 3 cup of amount of coffee that you had to put was the only thing that was not standardized. It was more of a side to basis.
So Vignesh, if we go a little deeper into the various types of brewing methods, correct me if I'm wrong, while there are hundreds of ways of making coffee, there largely seems to be 3 or 4 big schools of thought. Right? One is the pour over, which also seems fairly similar to the drip, like we spoke. And then there is the French press. The French press, in terms of time, seem to take a little bit longer, say about 4 to 5 minutes, as compared to the pour over or the drip, which is about 1 to 3 minutes. And then there is the AeroPress, which is again around the 1 to 2 minute sort of a time frame. And then there is the percolator, which takes slightly longer, at around 5 minutes or so. And then it goes on to the cold brew, which takes more than 24 hours or so. The way you describe, coffee engaging with water, it reminds me of the 4 things that we use to define food, right? The way we cook food and the way we appreciate food, which is heat, salt, fat, and acid. Right? What is the coffee equivalent when it comes to that?
Karthik, about the brewing methods, like you said, how do we classify by French press? There is an equivalent term to each of these that let me associate with. Like, for example, French press, I would term it as an immersion method, like when, water and coffee. In all these cases, in all these methods, like you said, French press, cold brew are immersion methods. The most common thing between both is, though it is water temperature, it is the grains, like grain sizes. Pour over, similarly grind size, and it is a drip method, like you said. But if you see the time, like you said, time, though it varies between each of the methods, the most impactful thing about all of this is the grind size. If you see, for example, let's take your first example of a French press. If you use finer grind size, time and temperature are the same, the taste is different. But if you use a coarser grind size, the time and temperature are the same, the taste is different. When water and the coffee grounds, like grind of different sizes, are interacting over a period in time, the taste changes. Though water temperature plays a role, but the impactful taste that any person can feel in their tongue is only the grind size. Finer the grinds, more it extracts. Coarser the grinds, less it extracts. So that is when in the cold brew, they use a coarser grind size, pour water and let it sit for any time between 12 to 24 hours.
Got it. So I did not know that the grind size actually plays a role in the taste, in the notes as well. So largely safe to say that it is the grind size and the time that water interacts with coffee. These are the 2 big variables when it comes to deciding how the coffee is going to turn out. Is that correct to say?
Yes, absolutely.
At this point, I want to quickly segue, Vignesh, to what you do in the Madras coffee movement. You work with a lot of producers and a lot of cafes and roasters as well. Right? What are you evangelizing?
What I saw from, when we spoke about the global version versus the Indian version of coffee, what I saw was during my travels abroad, so coffee was more than just something that you had at home. So there was a specialty associated with it. There were certain grades associated with it. And it was still available to the common person. At some place, you would know this is specialty coffee of North America, of Brazil, grown by this person. And this is how great it tastes. If you see, in comparison to what India had, we have specialty coffee. We do export it. It is available now or before you, thanks to a lot of roasters who've taken the time and getting the good coffees out there. But what I saw, at least the place where I stay and the places where I go to down south, is coffee is still has been one-dimensional per area. Like Kerala has a way of understanding, like this is how coffee is, like this is how coffee is. That this is how has been defined in through multiple factors, like what they grow, what they are used to. For example, chicory. But what that has happened is passing of that generation. The next generation, quite some time, has to go to a cafe, or for example, a simple example is like I was born and brought up in Madurai. We didn't have even one specialty coffee cafe in Madurai for me to understand what great coffee is back then. So I come to Chennai, I visit places like Bangalore, Bombay to understand, there's a completely different coffee scene here to what I see there. But tangentially, thinking of that, it is not the coffee scene, but it is the quality of coffee that can change the taste. Like if you brew it at home in the same brewing apparatus, same coffees, but it's just a different, let's not call it coffee bean, but it's a different version of the coffee. Why had that not been accessible at homes? The first one was the education part of it, where people didn't know, or people didn't, it is a very specialized thing. People have to invest time, effort to see if it was there, but everyone has a different lifestyle. But at the same time, the producers didn't know, I was not talking about the big scale producers, small scale producers inside Tamil Nadu, like Kolli Hills. We've had a place called Talanar near Coimbatore where they were growing coffee. The Anamalais ranges near Pollachi was growing coffee. You have Aircut, the Chevreuils region growing coffee. Palani Hills, called Palnis or Amt Hill Downs by the British, that was growing coffee. Everyone was growing coffee. The soil was great. They had potential to grow great coffees, but they were still not doing it. That also came down to education. So on a personal note, though my day job or what I work for professionally is a different stream, I wanted to invest a lot of time through the chain to see where all I can bridge or be a part of or help bringing specialty coffee scene to a common household. That's where it started. And that common household always related to the South Indian filter. Right. Like easily the first relation. And how do I standardize the South Indian filter at a global scale? What do I need to do to have a South Indian filter being served at a cafe in Europe or the United States as a very common beverage? Because during my travels, when I take the South Indian filter and also brew it with the beans that is there in a specialty coffee cafe in Europe or USA, done it a couple of times, people love the concept, people love the idea. It is just that we don't have a specific recipe that says this is the gram, this is the grind size, this is how you brew it, this is the time taken to extract it. That varies. And to the producer, coming back to the producer, they grow great coffees, but there are a few methods. For example, let's say how you pluck, how you process. What happens is the end result. That was lost in transition. But if a producer is able to get that, I wanted to work in a way where the producers have a directorate channel. And that can happen right now through the cafe. Because cafe in a city is the only point where person tries a lot of coffees. They go, they order a cup of coffee, they like it and they try. And the cafe also has a plus on that side, being able to serve these different coffees. So I consult for cafes where they have to improve their coffee menu, have a direct relationship with the buyer. With roasters, identifying a great source, blending them, roasting them, creating their roast profiles, and tracing back to the producer to help them grow good coffees.
You mentioned the filter coffee and you trying it with different global roasts, during your travels, etc. To me, from what you're saying, it seems like filter coffee has not really had that cappuccino moment where it is standardized and it is available exactly the same way, and it tastes almost the same way throughout, right? And that is what you're pursuing, and I'm assuming that's what you want to make happen. Vignesh, one of the other things you do, we spoke about cafes and what you do with them. One of the other stakeholders that you spend a lot of time with is the farming community, right? Especially small scale farmers. What is your quest on that front?
So, like how we refer to the filter coffee being a Madras emotion, being a more South Indian emotion. There's one part of South India where, my mother used to work in a small hill station called Kodaikanal. Adjacent to Kodaikanal are the Perumal Malay hill slopes. There, in the Coffee Board of India has also classified Palnis, or by the British it was called the Amt Hill Downs, as a coffee growing region, one of the specialty coffee growing region. Amongst all of that, let us take, instead of calling it a coffee estate, let us take a person who owns a small piece of land. It was gifted to them by the Britishers when they left, or however they got that land. They have a small piece of land. What they generally do is, during this harvest season, they pick the coffees, and it is measured by a term called unit. Like a unit can be 10 kilos, a unit can be 14 kilos, a unit can be 15 kilos or 20 kilos. They sell it by the unit. That's all. For a unit, they are paid a price. I am not here to say that the price is not a fair price. What I'm saying is the coffee that they pick, they grow, the soil, the care that they've taken. And some of these people are also tribals from that region, are of a much higher quality coffee than what they perceive or what they are paid for. So as a quest, it did take a challenge for me to first get them to trust me. But my first request to them was, this is the same unit you're selling to person A. You sell it to me. I'll give you to start off 2x for this coffees. And when I give 2x, there are small things that you have to do for me. For example, it's just a fruit. Instead of taking the unripe cherries, please take the ripe cherries and give me. Unripe cherries, please sort it separately and give me. They were telling me that they used to do it, and now they are not doing it because no one asks for it. So they said yes, and it's been 2 years. This is the second year that I'm working with them. One small thing to note, though I'm going to a technical detail, a specialty coffee is graded by points, 20, 30. A coffee that crosses 80 points, which is done by Q graders who are certified to give this point, with 80 plus, it's called a specialty coffee. So on the 2 years of working with them, last year, the coffees that we picked from those tribals, and it was certified by a friend who is a Q grader, or who's given us points at least, it crossed 80 points. That takes time and effort, but with all that they've been doing, it just needed a few basic principles to get it to that level. And when it's specialty coffee, it's obviously some of the cream of the whole market in the world, if you see the specialty coffee market from commercial. So I identified a few people. There are still so much more. And maybe the affinity towards the place where I was born with Tamil Nadu, I wanted to bring these farmers up onto a global scale where they do super specialty coffees, and it goes as specialty coffees from Tamil Nadu at a global market.
That's extremely inspiring, Vignesh. In this story, you also allude to these farmers not getting paid correctly. Is there a fair trade issue here? And by that, what I mean is there a discrepancy between what the goods is worth and what the farmer is actually getting paid for it?
Absolutely. So if you see at the international standards, there is a cup of excellence, a score sheet that is done through the coffee auction. For different cup prices, like for the different coffee prices, there are per pound or per LB prices that is mentioned, which is a fair trade price. If you compare to the similar quality of the coffees that these people pick versus the price that they are being paid, for that standard, they are paid, I would say, 3x lesser. So the first point that we took up was to pay them 3x the price that they were getting, irrespective of whatever coffee that they were giving us, whether it was sorted, whether it was free from defects, whether it was ripe, unripe, nothing. First, to pay them 3x, first let them understand the value of their coffee, and then improve the quality of that coffee.
But is the ecosystem sort of okay with this price correction? Did you see any resistance from the people who are purchasing from them?
Yeah, but if you see these kind of coffees, they go to a common local trader, the coffee trader, or he's called a coffee curing unit. The kind of coffees that they deal with are in tons, like literally 50 to 60 tons of coffees. Possibly, if it's 5 to 6 tribal farmers that I am helping, would not make a difference. But when the count becomes 100 to 200, it might be a small bit of change. Even though, I mean, this is the same situation across every coffee growing country. If you take Africa, you have the same farm doing direct trade with a coffee trader or a roaster outside his country and still selling it to the local market. So I think, if in my view, looking at the volume of coffee that is getting exported and the volume that you can do as specialty coffee, this will always coexist.
The other thing you mentioned is coffee grown in places like Parni and Erkard, etc. And I was just looking at the numbers of it. Right today, more than 50% of coffee that is grown in this country seems to come from the Chikmagalur or Karnataka belt, and only about 10 to 15% come from Tamil Nadu. Surprising for me was Kerala, which is roughly about 30-35% of coffee production. Right, but Kerala as a market for drinking coffee, or even Kerala as a cultural phenomenon in all of this, seems to be sort of missing conspicuously.
Yeah, Kerala, if you see, have a very high note for their pea berries. So pea berry is a coffee only. But in a cherry, if there are 2 beans, pea berry will have a single bean. Its taste characteristics. So one version of people will call it a defect. There's the other version who call it a very unique taste that gets into the coffee. If you see, all South Indian coffee start with a type of pea berry. That was popular in Kerala. And Kerala is popular for something called as the monsooning process, the initial monsooning process. It's called a monsooned version of the Arabica. It's called a monsoon Malabar because it was out of the Malabar coast. Right. And Kerala has a lot of Robusta. Kerala's high-grown Robustas are some of the best coffees that you can find in the country, like at a Robusta level. So maybe it is not served as much as popular that we do here. Like if you see Erkard has cafes and all of that. Kodaikanal has a lot of other cafes. Coffees from that region are sold, and you have Chennai, you have Bangalore for the most of the Coorg Chikmagalur belt. But in that, I think that is the only difference in, if you see for Kerala, after the coffee growing region, having a place where you can serve a lot of coffees. Coffee is so popular and all of that. And also, incidentally, Kerala grows a lot of tea as well. Like Kerala grows everything in abundance. It's so good. So you can't probably say, Kerala just grows one thing.
Right. You mentioned something about pea berries. Pea berries is technically coffee, right? Yeah,
it is. It is just the same coffee. I mean, it's just a variation of the green bean. Like a cherry will have 2 sides to it, 2 beans. Due to a way, the cherry will have only 1 bean, which is more rounded.
Got it. Because I think I got reminded of what I used to do when I was a kid. My job will always be to go to the nearest roaster, Coffee Works, which in our case was Leo, and buy half A and half pea berry, and then sort of grind it at home to make filter coffee. That always seemed like, not just for my household, but generally in the neighborhood, the right mix of things.
Yeah. A was just, we were talking about grades, you remember, like how was the coffee graded and stuff. A was the grade, it was the highest grade. Like you have double A, triple A and all of that. But you have A as a grade. Like it is the screen size of a coffee bean. In screen, you will have millimeters, centimeters, however way you want to denote it as the size of the green bean. So the boldest green beans were supposedly to have the richest of flavors.
Got it.
Now the theory can be conceptualized in different ways as to processing, score and all of that. But by A means the highest version of it. And pea berry, because of its structure and nature, it tends to add a lot of body to your beverage or a lot of structure to your beverage, the pea berry bean. So that proportion was always unique to that household or that region, like 50% A, PB. I've seen houses that has 40% A, 30% PB and 30% cherry. Cherry is the natural version of Arabicas. like Arabicas that are from the plantation. Two ways of processing more common: wet and natural. Wet is the plantation A, the A that you are saying. Natural is the cherry. It is just dried naturally. The cherry is dried naturally to remove the green bean out of it.
What is Vignesh's ideal cup of coffee? If you have to go get yourself the ideal cup of coffee, what beans, how do you roast it? What equipment do you use at home?
I'm not sure if I can call myself finicky, but I have come to a point where it takes me time to decide a cup of coffee. Like today, what brewing equipment. So being a passionate person with coffee, so I went and funded a lot of Kickstarter projects that make coffee equipments. And I have close to 30 to 40 equipments at my home to brew coffee, just to brew coffee. So it has to be a combination of what bean. And now that I work with a lot of farmers, to help them. And I have a small scale roaster at home. So let's say a farmer grows their produce and they want to know how it tastes. I roast them. So now that working with so many farmers, there's so much coffee also in the house. So it is about choosing the bean for the day. Like, let's say if it is a day when I have a lot of desserts and stuff, it's always going to be filter coffee. It's in the same filter coffee equipment, but the only standardization is I get to decide what is the grind size, the proportion of coffee to water and all of that. And next I have a handheld espresso machine. On a very hectic work day, it's multiple shots of espressos all through the day. Not to just keep me awake. I mean, for me, that coffee and awake is also a very emotional, psychological thing. Because I drink coffee, so I go to sleep the next 10 minutes, how late in the day it might be. So it's an espresso.
Same for me. People in my household can't understand that. I can have a fresh cup of coffee and then sleep in 10 minutes, right?
Yes.
Because coffee is more an emotional need than a physical need.
With drip coffees and the pour over, I like the version of the Japanese. The Japanese have a very specific, ratio, proportions, grind size to the pour over. I like that version of it. So on days when it's a very relaxed day, I absolutely have nothing to do, which is still a rarity. But I sit with a nice cup of drip coffee. Drip, though you have different equipments, different size of pour overs. So it is about calculating the grind size. There's a way to sift them, which is also a very traditional Indian method of sifting flour. So you sift the coffee grains to get everything of the exact grain size. So I have a screen size for the sifter, which is 300 micrometer or 400 micrometer, 700 micrometer. Sift them, make sure all grains are even. And then your water temperature, all of that for that matter. And make myself a perfect cup of coffee for that day.
Beautiful. So Vignesh, I want to end the episode with a quick coffee rapid fire. I think the last couple of years I've seen some really, really crazy trends in coffee. I think we can also call it a coffee myth busting. You already spoke about degree coffee.
Yeah.
And you spoke about how it is about the lactometer and not anything else. So I'm going to quickly throw a bunch of coffee trends at you. You tell me in 30, 40 seconds what you think of them.
Sure.
Firstly, let's start with meter coffee. What the hell is meter coffee and how did it get its name?
So, meter coffee is also a technical term, but a less known technical term because, when you make a filter coffee, like a tea master, a coffee master makes the filter coffee and adds the decoction and the milk and the sugar mixture is added. Now, let's say there are two vessels. One, the distance between vessel A to vessel B, which is at the upper hand versus the lower hand. Where he positions one at an upper region, one at the top, the other at the bottom. The distance between them when the coffee mixture travels, in a to and fro motion and it generates that automatic froth. That is 1 meter difference. And in 1 meter, for example, with his efficiency, he might do 10 to 12 times within probably 15 to 20 seconds before the temperature starts to decrease. And that translates to a very hot cup of coffee to you. That 1 meter difference creates a motion within the milk coffee mixture and makes it so frothy and creamy when it comes to your cup.
So it's a human equivalent of a frothing machine.
Yes, human equivalent. And the distance has to be more than a meter. Less than a meter, the froth doesn't stand.
Oh, interesting. Okay, cool. Nitro coffee. Are you a fan?
Yes, absolutely. Cold brews. When you drink a cold brew or a pour over, if you have an espresso, you have a bit of creaminess or you have a bit of fuller sense, right? When you sip it. So in case of these kind of diluted black coffees, the nitrogen oxide, or the way the nitrogen keg, or how you carbonate it with nitrogen. First thing is, it's a visual experience. When they pour it, it's like how you have a beer poured into your glass, with all the frothiness, with all the bubbles, with all the carbonation and stuff. It's not just that. What this also adds is a nice sweeter tinge to your palate. So it is a visual as well as a treat to the palate.
Brilliant. Second decoction. Are you a fan of that?
No, it is it is outside boundaries. It's outside every single boundary. Also, right. On a technical note, any extract, tea, coffee for that matter, when water and coffee coffee has close to 800 to 1200 chemical compounds in it. You add hot water, you extract a few. When you roast it, you bring out a few. There's so much to it. Let's say you have extracted a few. The time coffee and water are in contact, whatever is possible is already extracted. When you pour water, you still see the coffee color, but it is just stale water. It's just stale oils or whatever is the remnants of that grains or grounds that is present in any equipment that you do a second decoction with. And that just extracts into stale coffee water. And this is also for a coffee connoisseur or a person who appreciates all those notes, flavors and stuff. If it's just that the coffee is deterministic of a flavor, right? When people say coffee, they get a flavor in their mind. If it is only that, you can always do a second decoction. But if you want to appreciate coffee as is, it's advised not to do a second decoction.
Dalgona coffee. I can't end the episode without asking your point of view on this.
So, if I might go a bit technical, Dalgona coffee is not what it is supposed to be today. What actually Dalgona coffee was, in the Cuban history, if you ask for a Cuban cafecito, which means the same kind of sugar, or we all know a mocha pot, the stovetop percolator. The thickest extract of a mocha pot and sugar is whisked using the spoon to the same creamy texture that you see on Instagram, you see on YouTube. And the remaining part of the mocha pot is added to it. And they don't add milk, they don't add cream. It just is a good and an appreciable version of the Dalgona coffee. If you see some of the Asian countries, they like having instant coffee, and this, I think, is a media version of it or a social media version of it. The original Dalgona coffee existed as a Cuban cafecito. You can Google it. You can find videos on YouTube. It is a better and a stronger and a much more flavorful version of this Dalgona coffee, of what Dalgona coffee was all about.
Got it. There is this point of view. You spoke about it, a little bit earlier when you said the moment you add milk, you're anyways taking away a part of the flavor and the note.
Yeah.
What is the right way, for a regular audience to look at milk through this lens? And also, there is this other fad which is about oat milk, right? They say oat milk goes with coffee better, it brings it out better, etc. What's your take on that?
Two things. First thing was South Indians or Indians having it with milk was a completely different scenario. It was for a good reason. The coffees here, let's say the initial coffees were roasted a bit dark. It was a bit astringent to the palate. And the kind of good quality milk that we had over here, farm fresh cow milk, it blended to the taste very well. It brought in a nice flavorful cup. So they stuck with that. Now, as we advance in terms of different roasting methods, bringing out lighter roast, bringing out roast that can literally amplify what is there in your cup. If you're getting a good specialty coffee, you can try it with multiple brewing methods. But if you stick to a nice black coffee, it'll amplify the coffee in itself. If you are still going for a dark roasted coffee, there is still Italian roast. It's called a full city plus, or a Vienna roast, or a French roast, where it's woody, ashy, smoky flavors. It's a burnt caramelish flavor. That will go great with milk. So for that, instead of having it black, when you have it with milk, that is an elevated experience. So in that case, if you see, milk still plays a part in the way we drink coffee, but not to all coffees. For some coffees, if you take a good specialty coffee and you do it with milk, some of the flavors are completely muted. You would lose on the richest experience that you've actually paid for. So This is the take on milk. to alternate milk, for example, we'll go to the previous point where coffee is 98% water and 2% coffee. Let's say if initially, if you see, buffalo milk was so prevalent in the country than cow milk at a point in time.
Right.
There are traditional estate owners who prefer a good South Indian filter coffee with buffalo milk. Their filter coffee extract would also be thick. The milk is extremely thick in terms of its fat, in terms of its consistency. And that is a great cup. It's a very fulfilling cup. The similar example is when you go to a medium roast or a light roasted coffees, if you are adding a milk of this much fat or a creamy consistency, there is nothing in the cup left but with milk. But when you take milk from oat or soy or almonds, it is not as creamy and thick as your full fat cow milk. And also soy milk has a bit of an aftertaste, whereas oat milk does not have that. And it is also a perceived notion of how a person perceives oat milk versus other milk. So in that perception, oat milk does also have an upper hand when it has to bring out a flavor of a coffee and not put in a milky taste to the cup.
And if you go with my current Instagram feed, 9 out of 10 posts on coffee are about wine-infused coffee. Have you ever tried one? Especially the Madras coffee? What's your take on that? Right? Yeah.
One part of post-coffee processing is using these alcohol barrels. And it gives you a boozy plus a great specialty coffee taste. It is a must-try for anyone who loves a good cup of black coffee. And if I may name a few estates and roasters, in Bangalore, there is Bean Rove, a grower cum roaster. He has one of the most brilliant barrel-aged coffees in this country that I've had.
Wow. Okay. Otherwise, any roasters that you would like to recommend across the country for the listeners?
Yes. There is a very big list, but I'll go with my top 5. Always being the first, being patriotic to the place that I now live, Chennai. There's a place called the Farm Chennai. It's a dairy farm. It also has a shop which is of the farm produce. Now we have a roastery inside the farm. We get from some of the best estates in the country. You could try, the blends also have a story to it. You could try their blends. Number 2 is, there's a great estate in the country called Ratnagiri Estate. Any roaster that serves Ratnagiri Estate, please close your eyes, go for it. If you want a great cup of South Indian filter coffee, back here in Chennai, there's a brand called Dabra Coffee who work with some of the growers only from down south Tamil Nadu and make a good cup of South Indian filter coffee. And Nagpur, Corridor 7 Coffee Roasters, he was one of India's Q graders. All of his blends are a must try. If you are in Bangalore, if you're looking for a cup of coffee that doesn't cost too much but gives you great coffees, JP Nagar, it's a small place called Benki Coffee. Amazing roasters. They help a lot in the specialty coffee movement also in the country, led by Mr. Suhas Dwaraknath. That is the specialty coffee academy of the country as well. Very good coffees there. And Saverworks Roasters, Delhi.
Excellent. I don't think I've consumed from any of these 5.
Okay.
So really looking forward to this. I want to end with one thing that usually gets attributed to people like us who take coffee very seriously, which is being the coffee Nazi, right? What is your take? And I want this to be the absolute last question of our conversation.
Sure.
What is your take on instant coffee? Have you ever had a cup of instant coffee in the last 6 years?
Yes, I did. So I've had a cup of specialty instant coffee. So you see, instant coffee is just when you brew. Simple example is, I didn't want to get too technical, but that's how it always goes. A cup of coffee is 98% water and 2% coffee. So
Wow.
The brewed coffee, 2% is only made into instant. If you have a way to make specialty instant coffee, for example, let's say I make this perfect method, like I say at home. If I make that as an instant and give it to you, you can also enjoy that perfect method. I like the method of how you can transport coffee at an instant to another person. But how commercially the market has made for people accessing bad quality coffee as instant. And I would suggest if there was a way where we would have made good quality coffee available as instant, people would have understood the value of coffee more. or the taste of coffee more.
Right.
It was not just, and instant, if you see, most people drink it with milk. If I'm not wrong, most people drink it with milk.
Yeah.
That already shadows most of the qualities of that coffee. So you know what you're getting it finally. It is just some bold, dark beverage. So the way instant is marketed now is something that I'm against. But the concept of how you can make instant coffee is something that I'm for.
Right. Actually, it sounds more like a science which could have actually led to a lot of personalization.
Yes.
Has done the opposite of it, which is make it very, very, very mass produced.
Mass produced, yes.
Right. Great. Vignesh, thank you so much for being on the show. This is one of the most exhilarating conversations I've ever had on the show. Thank you. Thanks so much for
Thank you for it. Thanks to IVM Podcast for having me. And like you said, this is my first ever podcast. So I'm equally thrilled and happy about it.
The pleasure was all ours. If you like this podcast, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can listen to us on the IVM Podcast app or ivmpodcasts.com. You can also follow us on our social media. We are at IVM Podcasts on Twitter and Instagram. And if you want to reach out to me, I am _Karthik. That's Karthik with an H on Twitter. And filter_coffee. That's coffee with a K on Instagram.
पेश खिदमत है आपकी शान में हमारे अंजुमन से. Hi, I am Sadaf.
And I'm Arshit. खाने का इतिहास, economics, policy, psychology, सब है मेन्यू पर.
Only on the Nankali podcast every Wednesday. सिर्फ IVM podcast app या वेबसाइट पर या फिर जहां से भी आप अपने पॉडकास्ट सुनते हो.
Entertainment is like food for the brain. It's a window to culture and a great way to understand the world around us. The internet has changed what it means to be an entertainer, creating new storytellers with millions of fans. It has spawned a new breed, the story sellers, those behind the scenes creating the business for this ecosystem. They work with brands, platforms and channels who are keen to capitalize on an audience hungrier than ever for more stories. I'm Vineet Kanabar, and I have a ringside view to how stories are told and sold. On my show, I bring you creators, artists, executives, and marketers for a freewheeling conversation around the business of entertainment. Tune in to Storytellers and Story Sellers for personal stories, analysis, and criticism every Thursdays as I talk to the brightest minds telling or selling great stories today.